During World War II, the US Army had tanks, and they had tank destroyers. Logically, you'd think that the tank destroyers were supposed to be better at destroying tanks. It turns out they weren't. In fact, the whole thing was such a disaster that by the end of the war, every single tank destroyer battalion was dissolved, and the entire branch and idea were scrapped for good. And who had it the worst? You guessed it right, the tank destroyer crews. So what went wrong? Okay, so let's start with the problem that would bring the tank destroyers into existence, and then go from there as we like to do, in logical and chronological order. It all started when America watched the French army, which was by the way at the time considered the strongest army in Europe, get literally annihilated by the German Wehrmacht. And what shocked the American planners was not really the outcome as much as the new threat on the battlefield: tanks. But not just tanks, also the way they were being used by the Germans, which was revolutionary at the time and had proven extremely effective. The Germans were concentrating their tanks in so-called armored spearheads, and these would penetrate even the strongest defensive lines, or just use their mobility to bypass them and attack at the weakest point, like Rommel would later perfect in North Africa. Towed anti-tank guns that were the primary way of fighting tanks back then were simply not mobile enough to get where they were needed in time and set up for action. They were bypassed, surrounded, or overrun by the tanks in quick, decisive, aggressive charges. So, this created an existential crisis for the US Army, because at the time, their most modern anti-tank weapon was this little thing, the 37mm towed anti-tank gun, and basically they didn't have anything to counter this problem. They also didn't prioritize tank development in the interwar period, nowhere near as much as the Germans did. And on top of that, they thought that tanks were supposed to support the infantry and not to fight other tanks, at least not if they didn't really need to. So there was nothing they had that could counter German blitzkrieg tactics centered around the armored spearheads. That was the problem that would lead to the creation of tank destroyers. But it wasn't going to be really smooth, as you're about to see. One of the ideas that would bring up the tank destroyer concept was that the brains of the army argued it was stupid to use a medium tank worth about $35,000 at the time to destroy another tank, when the job could be done by a gun that cost just a fraction of that. They got the idea to create a specific branch that would be tasked with handling enemy tanks. Because the static anti-tank defenses couldn't be on the front line in all places at the same time and in sufficient numbers to fight off the enemy tank charges, the doctrine they came up with was something like a fire department, just with tank destroyers instead of fire trucks. They were originally called anti-tank battalions, but you'd have to agree that tank destroyer sounds way cooler and more terrifying. These battalions would be held in reserve behind the lines, and when the enemy armor appeared and had most likely already broken through the front lines, the tank destroyers would then move in as quickly as possible to meet the armored spearhead. They would maneuver into favorable positions and ambush, flank and destroy enemy tanks with their superior firepower, and move the hell out before the enemy could even know what had hit them. The tactic known as shoot and scoot. Crews got their shoulder patch with a Black Panther crushing an enemy tank in its jaws, and because of this, the tank destroyers wouldn't even need armor to stop anything more than rifle rounds and shrapnel, because speed would be their protection. So, they tested the tank destroyer concept in rigged field exercises with ridiculous rules where they came out looking like the perfect solution. Everything worked out great in theory, but now given that times had changed, they had to find a way to make the guns move quickly, and to give at least some protection to their crew instead of just sitting in the open like with the towed guns. The first tank destroyers, if we can call them that, were actually the gun motor carriages. The first workhorse tank destroyers, before they could build one on purpose like they wanted, were hybrids of whatever guns and vehicles they had lying around. That's how the M6 gun motor carriage was born. It had a 37mm anti-tank gun mounted on a 3/4-ton truck, with the gun facing backward, because when they tried mounting it forward, the muzzle blast injured the driver and shattered the windshield. So the thing literally had to back into its firing positions. And they made about 5,000 of them, at just a little over $4,000 each, making them the cheapest American tank destroyer of the war. However, they were so good that after Tunisia, surviving units were converted back into cargo trucks. Since the 37mm was already obsolete by this point, they put a World War I era 75mm gun onto an M3 half-track, creating the M3 gun motor carriage. They added a few steel plates to stop small arms fire, but only from the front side, so the crew wasn't much more protected than with a towed gun. However, the real deal began at Camp Hood, which became a factory producing tank killer crews. They trained extensively there with these new tactics in mind, but it was obvious that they couldn't drive in reverse on cargo trucks and half-tracks against German armor, which was arguably the best in the world at the time. They needed something that was an actual purpose-built tank destroyer. So, this led to none other than the M10. It was built on the proven M4 Sherman chassis, but with stripped-down armor to save weight, and an open-top turret for better visibility, because whoever saw the enemy first would fire first, and that is usually what decides the outcome of the battle. Unlike the Germans with their assault guns/tank destroyers, the Americans wanted turrets, and for armament, they had a 3-inch gun derived from a World War I era anti-aircraft gun. The M10 even got higher production priority than the Sherman, so you see just how seriously they took this concept. Now, the M10 was supposed to be lighter than a Sherman, so it could be faster, right? The upper front hull was 38mm, sloped at 55 degrees, compared to the Sherman's roughly 51mm at a similar angle, while the hull sides were just 19mm, half of the Sherman's. But then the first problems appeared. The gun weighed about 2,000 pounds and sat at the front of the turret, which made the whole thing severely front-heavy, so it couldn't even traverse without counterweights. They added 2,500 pounds of counterweights on the opposite side to balance the turret, which neutralized the weight savings from thinning the armor, and the resulting vehicle weighed just about 3 tons less than the standard Sherman, but now with far less protection. And if you know anything about tanks, you'd know that the Sherman wasn't really the best protected tank in the world, and now the M10 was even less protected, with the open turret that on top of that wasn't powered but hand cranked. A full 360-degree rotation took about 80 seconds at best, while the Sherman could turn its turret in about 18 seconds. It didn't have an auxiliary unit to charge batteries like the Sherman, so it had to run the engine to charge them, and there goes your silent ambush advantage. Speed was not drastically greater than the Sherman's, just about 5 miles per hour higher top speed. By the way, if you get confused with the names for the M10, Achilles, and Wolverine, the thing is that the M10 that the British got through Lend-Lease was rearmed with their powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun, the same one they were cramming into Sherman Fireflies. And that was called Achilles. The Wolverine was used after the war for the M10 and was never really a nickname during the war. However, the M10 wasn't ready in time for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa to fight the Germans there. So, these Frankenstein improvised gun motor carriages would be the first quote-unquote tank destroyers to see combat, and the result was, as you might expect. The 37mm was almost completely useless against German medium tanks, not to mention the lack of protection for the crews. The 75mm could do the job, but the crews, trained to advance aggressively without any armor against the best tank crews in the world at the time, quickly learned that this wasn't the smartest and safest thing to do. At Kasserine Pass, tank destroyer units were deployed in exactly the scenario they trained and were built for, to stop a massive enemy tank spearhead. But the inexperienced crews tasted reality for the first time. What followed was the first major American defeat, and among the most beat-up units were exactly the tanks and tank destroyers. So they learn, they reorganize, and they try again 1 month later at El Geta, where the tank destroyer crews knocked out about 30 German tanks. Not bad until you hear that they lost 21 gun motor carriages and suffered 72 casualties in that same fight. Although the concept had worked, if you look at it, it worked at a horrible cost. But we can say that they had the wrong tool for the job, right? So the M10 arrives in North Africa, but already at the end of the campaign, barely seeing any action. Then came the next campaign, the invasion of Sicily, where M10s could prove themselves. But here is when the whole tank destroyer idea fell apart completely, because the Italian terrain, with mountains, narrow valleys, and tight streets, made the kind of armored spearhead they were designed to counter impossible. So the vehicle designed to fight tanks gets loaded with about 10 high-explosive shells for every 1 AP round and goes into the support role, working as mobile artillery or assault guns. They were now used as the real tanks, just with the nice benefit of the tank destroyer's open top, thin armor, and shells that were less effective than standard Sherman high explosives. The M10's high explosive shell had almost half the explosive content of the Sherman's shells. As for the anti-tank role, when German tanks appeared every now and then, the 3-inch gun itself was well regarded, reliable, accurate, and effective against Panzer IIIs, IVs, and most other German vehicles they encountered, at least until the arrival of the Panther. But America was already developing the next generation of tank destroyers, because the M10 turned out to be too slow. They launched a new thing, now really built from the ground up, rather than on the chassis of something they already had. This evolved into none other than the M18, or better known as the Hellcat. Now this one was actually something they wanted all along, light and quick with quite a punch. It had a radial engine with about 400 horsepower and a Torgmatic automatic transmission combined with a torsion bar suspension. This made the Hellcat the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the entire Second World War, with a 55 miles per hour top speed, which by the way wouldn't be broken until the M1 Abrams in the 1980s. It weighed only about 18 tons with half an inch of armor and also an open top turret, so there was essentially no protection against anything heavier than a rifle round. Sometimes not even that. But the turret was power traversed, thank God. And it came with the new 76mm gun, the one that was going on the upgraded Shermans as well. It said that a well-trained crew could fire up to 20 rounds in a mad minute. So that is some serious firepower for a vehicle that could now finally get in fast. Fire a bunch of rounds, cause chaos, then scoot